We begin with the biggest release so far of files relating to the late financier and sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. More than 3 million pages have been made available, including thousands of videos and images, with references to multiple public figures, including Donald Trump. US authorities are hoping to draw a line under the affair, but survivors of Epstein's crimes say it's not over yet.
3 million pages, 2,000 videos, and 180,000 pictures, mentioning people such as the US President, the then Prince Andrew, and Elon Musk. These are just a sample of what the enormous amount of new documents released by the Justice Department contain.
We did not protect President Trump. We didn't protect or not protect anybody.
The latest Epstein files were made public after they were withheld from an initial release in December. The new records include thousands of references to Donald Trump, including emails in which Epstein and others shared news articles about him, commented on his politics, or gossiped about him and his family.
Millions of pages, federal records emails, calendars, internal notes, and archive tips have now reopened the Jeffrey Epstein case in a way few expected. Buried inside are documented contradictions, unexplained continuities after his 2008 conviction, and records indicating that Epstein himself believed he possessed leverage over people at the highest levels of power figures, whose names include Bill Gates, Elon Musk, Donald Trump, and Bill Clinton. The document release, often described as a massive FBI file dump in records that had previously remained inaccessible to the public. These materials vary widely in reliability and evidentiary weight. Some are routine administrative records. Others are second or third-hand allegations, and some are drafts or internal communications never intended for an external audience. None of this material by itself constitutes a legal finding. Yet taken together, the records undermine the long-standing assertion that there was no credible evidence of blackmail or coercive leverage connected to Epstein. What emerges instead is a picture that is incomplete, uneven, and unsettling precisely because it does not resolve cleanly into innocence or guilt. Central to the renewed scrutiny is the behavior of Epstein himself, not only before his 2008 conviction, but afterward. Epstein pleaded guilty in 2008 to soliciting a minor for prostitution, a fact that was public and widely reported. The expectation that followed, at least in theory, was that major institutions, philanthropies, and prominent individuals would sever ties. The records show that this expectation was not consistently met. Post-plea contact appears repeatedly in calendars, emails, and scheduling notes, raising questions not about criminal participation but about judgment, disclosure, and truthfulness. One of the most discussed figures in the newly examined records is Bill Gates, whose interactions with Epstein after 2008 have been previously reported but are now accompanied by additional context. Among the material cited in commentary is an email Epstein drafted to himself, describing sensitive personal information about Gates and framing it in a way that resembles leverage. The email was not sent, and there is no direct evidence that such information was ever used as blackmail. Drafts, by their nature, reflect intent or contemplation rather than action. Still, the existence of such a document complicates earlier claims that Epstein did not engage in blackmail or that there was no credible indication he attempted to do so. Independent reporting by the Wall Street Journal had previously noted that Epstein threatened Gates over an alleged affair, a claim Gates has denied while acknowledging poor judgment in meeting Epstein. The newly discussed materials do not resolve that dispute, but they reinforce the idea that Epstein perceived leverage as something he possessed or could construct. The documents also show that financial interactions continued in certain contexts, including donations routed to institutions where Epstein retained influence. These transactions are not proof of coercion, but they invite questions about why an individual who was supposedly being distanced would still appear in pathways involving significant sums of money. Another prominent figure repeatedly referenced in commentary surrounding the files is Elon Musk. Musk has publicly stated that he refused invitations to Epstein's private island and denied having a social relationship with him. Emails included in the released materials show Musk communicating with Epstein about travel plans in the Caribbean region and expressing interest in social gatherings. These emails do not prove that Musk ever visited Epstein's island, nor do they establish any criminal conduct. They do, however, conflict with the absolute nature of some public denials. The discrepancy matters not because it proves wrongdoing, but because it illustrates how public narratives can diverge from private communications. Calendars and emails are inherently limited forms of evidence. A scheduled meeting does not guarantee that a meeting occurred, and an invitation does not imply acceptance. Yet when multiple records across several years show repeated planning, follow-ups, and rescheduling, it becomes harder to maintain the position that there was no meaningful association at all. The issue raised by these documents is not primarily legal, but reputational and institutional. How transparent were public figures about their interactions? And how accurate were the statements made to the public once Epstein's crimes were widely known? The same tension appears in the case of Howard Lutnick, who publicly described Epstein as the greatest blackmailer ever, while simultaneously portraying his own contact as minimal and repellent. Lutnick recounted a single uncomfortable encounter in 2005 that led him to avoid Epstein entirely. Emails and travel-related communications from years later suggest further contact, including planned meetings in the Caribbean. Again, these records do not establish criminal behavior. What they do establish is inconsistency. Vivid recollections of one encounter coexist with apparent omissions of others, raising questions about selective memory and narrative framing. These inconsistencies matter because they intersect with a broader institutional response to Epstein. Federal agencies repeatedly stated that there was no credible evidence of a blackmail operation. Yet Epstein's own behavior, as reflected in documents, suggests that he believed leverage to be central to his relationships. He documented sensitive information, referenced confidentiality agreements, and expressed frustration when influential contacts attempted to distance themselves. Whether these efforts succeeded is unknown. Whether they were legal is a separate question. But the assertion that there was no credible evidence becomes harder to sustain when internal records show preparation, intent, or perceived leverage, even if the execution remains unproven. The files also contain numerous tips submitted to the FBI's National Threat Operations Center. These entries are among the most sensitive and controversial aspects of the release. Many are anonymous. Some were explicitly deemed not credible by investigators. Others lack sufficient detail to be verified. The presence of such tips does not validate their claims, and responsible analysis requires restraint. Anonymous allegations, especially those submitted close to politically sensitive periods such as elections, must be treated with caution. The documents themselves often include notes indicating follow-up interviews or determinations of credibility, reminding readers that raw tips are not findings. At the same time, the existence of these tips challenges another common argument, that if credible allegations existed against powerful figures, they would have surfaced long ago. The files demonstrate that information can exist within federal systems for years without becoming public, either because it fails to meet evidentiary thresholds, because investigations stall, or because institutional incentives favor caution and containment. This does not mean that suppressed information is true. It means that absence from public view is not proof of absence. Political figures appear in the documents as well, most often through indirect references, third-hand allegations, or records of social proximity rather than through direct evidentiary claims. Donald Trump and Bill Clinton are among the most frequently cited names, reflecting their prominence rather than the strength of the material itself. Their inclusion arises largely from submissions to federal reporting systems, internal summaries, and contextual mentions rather than from substantiated investigative findings. Many of these references are explicitly labeled as unverified, anonymous, or lacking sufficient corroboration, and several are accompanied by internal notes indicating that follow-up assessments did not establish credibility. This distinction is critical, as the mere presence of a name in a federal file does not equate to validation of the claim attached to it. Both Trump and Clinton have publicly acknowledged limited social contact with Epstein in the past, consistent with Epstein's broader pattern of cultivating relationships with influential individuals across political, financial, and cultural spheres. Both have also denied any involvement in Epstein's criminal activities, and no criminal charges or adjudicated findings have been brought against either in connection with Epstein's crimes. The newly released materials do not alter that legal reality. They do not provide sworn testimony, forensic evidence, or investigative conclusions that would meet the standards required for prosecution or formal accusation. What the documents do reveal, however, is how Epstein's social orbit overlapped with political power, and how allegations involving high-profile figures were handled within federal systems. Tips and complaints referencing political leaders were logged, categorized, and in many cases preliminarily evaluated, reflecting standard institutional procedures rather than exceptional treatment. In some instances, records note concerns about timing, particularly where submissions coincided with politically sensitive periods, such as election cycles. In others, they reflect the inherent difficulty of assessing credibility when allegations are removed by several degrees from first-hand testimony. A recurring figure in these narratives is Ghislaine Maxwell, who was convicted for her role in Epstein's trafficking operation. Maxwell's conviction establishes that Epstein did not operate alone in committing his crimes. It does not, by itself, establish a broader criminal conspiracy involving every prominent person he encountered. Yet her role underscores the reality that Epstein's operations were structured, facilitated, and sustained over time. This context is essential when evaluating claims about blackmail or leverage. Organized criminal activity often relies on documentation, intermediaries, and contingency planning, even when not all plans are carried out. What becomes increasingly clear when reading through commentary on the files is that the core scandal may not be reducible to a list of guilty names. Instead, it lies in the gap between public assurances and private records. Institutions spoke with certainty about the absence of blackmail, while internal documents show Epstein preparing, contemplating, or claiming leverage. Public figures issued categorical denials that conflict with emails suggesting ongoing contact. Federal agencies emphasized closure while continuing to receive, archive, and assess allegations long after the case was supposedly settled. This gap erodes trust even in the absence of new convictions. Transparency is not only about proving crimes, it is about accurately representing what is known, what is unknown, and what remains unresolved. The Epstein files reveal how often those distinctions were blurred. Statements intended to reassure the public may have overstated certainty. Denials crafted to protect reputations may have sacrificed precision for absoluteness. Over time, these choices created a brittle narrative that fractures under scrutiny. It is also important to recognize the limitations of the current release. Millions of pages sound comprehensive, but they represent only a portion of the total record. Documents are redacted. Context is missing. Some communications reference attachments that are not included. Others hint at relationships or events without elaboration. The public is seeing fragments, not a complete mosaic. Drawing definitive conclusions from such material would be premature. Still, fragments can be revealing. They show patterns of behavior, institutional habits, and narrative strategies. They show how power operates in proximity to scandal through silence, selective disclosure, and managed distance. They show how official language can minimize uncertainty while private records remain open-ended. And they show how difficult it is to fully disentangle truth, reputation, and self-interest once trust has been compromised. The renewed attention to Epstein's files does not deliver closure. Instead, it reopens questions that were assumed to be settled. Did Epstein attempt to blackmail powerful individuals? The documents suggest he believed he could and may have tried, but do not prove successful execution. Did prominent figures lie about their associations? In several cases, public statements appear at odds with private records. Did institutions mislead the public? At minimum, they expressed greater certainty than the underlying material seems to justify. In the end, the significance of the file release may lie less in what it proves than in what it reveals about how information is managed when it intersects with power. Epstein's crimes were real and devastating. The suffering of his victims is not in question. What remains in question is how many layers of influence, leverage, and protection surrounded him, and how those layers shape the stories told afterward. The documents do not answer that question definitively. They do something more modest and more troubling. They show that the story the public was given was, at best, incomplete. As additional materials are reviewed and contextualized, clearer answers may emerge, or they may not. What is certain is that confidence has been shaken, not because a single document proves everything, but because the accumulation of records makes it harder to believe that nothing was there. Transparency does not guarantee justice, but its absence almost always guarantees suspicion. The Epstein files, in their fragmented and unsettling form, ensure that this chapter is not as closed as many were led to believe.